Ron is a very good friend of mine, ex-neighbor and a colleague, and so he's asked me to bore you as a sociologist. So as a sociologist, what I have to do, right, I have to talk about movement of capital at the expense of people, and I think you were talking about that before. And the conversion of homes, we tend to think about the places in which we live as homes for us, for ourselves, for our families, and for our community. But however, homes are converted as places to live in, to businesses from which to make a profit. And so we have to think about those particular differences, is that we think of our neighborhoods and our community as homes for us, and other people look at them as places that they can make a profit from. And we always have to remember that one person's crisis is often somebody else's opportunity. Now, historically, the oldest citified neighborhoods, I'm not talking about Canarsie, I'm talking about Bushwick, Williamsburg, Fort Greene, Bedford-Stuyvesant, etc. They developed really from the north to the south. That's the way it developed in Brooklyn. And it was that pattern for the deterioration from the core of Manhattan in the 1950s and 60s, right? And it's the same pattern for this, what they call the revitalization of neighborhoods, as they are improved and deteriorated. And here I'm emphasizing neighborhoods being improved and deteriorated as active verbs. It just doesn't happen. It's done, okay, in order to make them profitable. Once the threat to Bedford-Stuyvesant and other Brooklyn communities were no mortgages, mortgage redlining, insurance redlining, decreases in city services. We remember those things. We're probably still suffering from them. Some of you may remember the word triage, right? The idea that New York City actually was contemplating in the 1970s cutting off neighborhoods in New York City where the tax revenue wasn't sufficient, and so therefore was the idea we're going to cut services to those particular neighborhoods. We've heard of words in the rest of the world about ethnic cleansing. Well, there was ethnic cleansing also in Brooklyn, and that was during the phase of urban renewal. I'll make mention of that again. And now we have a new crisis, and it's the reverse flow of capital. Where the capital was going out, now the capital is coming back, and now the problem is low interest rates. But you might not be able to get them, but they're low interest rates. Mortgage fraud, which was also spoken before. Some of you seem to be as old as I am, and remember that in the 1950s and 1960s, there was the FHA mortgage scandal, which affected the same neighborhoods. Right? You could take the same map and look at it and see that that had occurred before. So they're kind of new weapons. I also have to know that gentrification in Bedford-Stuyvesant and other places in Brooklyn occurred in the late 60s and 1970s, but what slowed it down was the fiscal crisis and the recessions that followed. Also important to notice, because this history of the African-American and Afro-Caribbean population in Brooklyn is significant, but is also significant in terms of understanding the demography of it. In 1920, there's only 31,000 people classified as black in Brooklyn. Right? 1930 was 68,000. 1940, 107,000. 1950, 208,000. 1960, 371,000. 1970, 656,000. 1980, 722,000. You're talking about a tremendous growth and tremendous power at that particular time. African Americans have been living in Bedford-Stuyvesant since colonial times, and several other places in Brooklyn as well. And much of that time, working and middle class and upper middle class and upper class African Americans were living in those particular places. Bed-Stuy, Fort Greene, Crown Heights, Brooklyn Museum area. There's so many of these, Clinton Hill, etc. And they were buffered. They built and they were buffered by small and larger scale community and fraternal organizations. There was so much of this activity going on. Churches, private schools. Right? And then later we see the development of larger organizations that I remember, Pratt Area Community Council, Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation, etc. Those things came about. They were built upon existing structures before. Now what I want to do is to read a little bit about how the 1960s and 1970s were characterized. We get a sense of the context. From Los Angeles to New York City, crosses are burned, school buses are stoned, and houses firebombed in attacks and counterattacks. Many more skirmishes take place in the courts and zoning agencies, but the primary battle zone lies within the minds of local community residents who are fearful of neighborhood change. This is another kind of social and psychological contest taking place in American cities today. This is 60s and 70s, the outcome of which may determine whether the specter of necropolis that hangs over many of our urban areas is to become a reality. In essence, we as a nation must decide for ourselves if our dying and decaying urban centers are worth saving. If the current urban crisis, 60s and 70s, is any indication of our national attitude towards older cities, and I think it is, the decision has already been made in the negative. And I wrote that back in those days, because that was what we were confronting in those days. Further disinvestment took place. Deindustrialization took place. Loss of good-paying middle and working-class jobs. Continuation of mortgage and insurance redlining. The roots of success for previous poor and working-class immigrants, white immigrants, all right, disappeared, all right? New York City as an economic engine, I can't emphasize this more, for the groups who came to New York City dried up. The ideal, what would make the problem today less of a problem, the ideal would have been for the city to have provided the African American and other populations who came in the 50s and 60s with their just reward. Right? People came here to work and those jobs disappeared. Then we get globalization, movement of capital back, low interest rates, ripple effects of Manhattan investment. Right? So we see that process. Later, I'm writing now a few years ago. As to New York City mayors, Rudy Giuliani was iconic in terms of disdain for non-white residents of Central City neighborhoods. But Bloomberg has been quieter and more effective. Right? An important approach by a couple of sociologists, they noted in New York City the organization of spaces and real estate dominated by those who control social and economic capital. Right? This is the globalization. This is what they said. They wanted to make New York City more competitive in the global economy. But competitive for what? I would add, competitive for whom? One of the first things Bloomberg did was to say, we only want corporations that can afford to be here. He didn't say that about people, but in fact the policy carries over to people. There is an out-migration of New York City of low-income people, particularly Hispanics. They're moving to small towns in Pennsylvania, upper New York State. African Americans also, as you know. Conditions for them in New York City are appalling. Meanwhile, the conditions of life for the very, very rich are absolutely wonderful. According to another sociologist, the Bloomberg administration sought to brand New York as a luxury city by attracting high-impact industries such as finance, information technologies, biotechnology, and media, all of which were high-margin, high-value-added industries. Exclusive and class-specific branding strategies were then adopted for target marketing class-specific perks. The city's highly skilled labor pool, high-quality education, as well as high-end cultural and lifestyle amenities for the professional and executive class. The goal of the Luxury City campaign was to build a physical city that appealed to these global elites by attracting high-end retailers, hotels, stadiums, and residential towers. Right? Well, that's the context of it. That's the broadest context for it. You know, Bedford-Stuyvesant had gone through two crises and in the middle of one now. And I think, you know, from my particular perspective, it's particularly this economic issue, right? The city not providing the opportunities to move into the middle class and the upper middle class as had been true before. Right? Thank you.